Hello, and welcome to the webinar, A Supplemental Poverty Measure, What It Will and Won't Do. It is my pleasure to introduce Mike Laracy, Director of Policy Reform and Advocacy for the Annie E. Casey Foundation. He will be the moderator for today's presentation. Mike, the floor is all yours.
Hi, this is Mike, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first of two webinars on the Supplemental Poverty Measure, which is being developed as we speak by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These two webinars are co-sponsored by Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, Half in 10, the National League of Cities, the Brookings Center on Children and Families, and the New America Foundation. I'm thrilled to say that we've got almost 1,000 folks registered today, so on behalf of all five organizations, welcome to all of you. As you know, the Census Bureau plans to issue the Supplemental Poverty Measure, which we have abbreviated to SPM, in the fall of 2011 when the 2010 poverty rates are released. The purpose of these two webinars is to get a solid grounding about what the supplemental measure would and would not accomplish. As I mentioned, this is a two-part series. The part one today will provide a chance for the audience to get grounded in the essentials. It's sort of a primer. Part two, next Tuesday, April 21st, will feature Becky Blank, the Undersecretary of Commerce, who will really get into a little bit more detail about the elements of the poverty measure, supplemental poverty measure, particularly emphasizing the areas that are still under review and for which decisions have yet to be made. She'll be joined by Ron Haskins, my buddy from Brookings, who will talk about why this exercise, this effort should be a bipartisan one. Mark Levitan from New York City Center for Economic Opportunity will talk about the city's experience with an alternative poverty measure, and the session will be moderated by Cliff Johnson from the National League of Cities. If you've not registered for next week, it's not too late. Let me just highlight a couple points that will be made again and again throughout, I think, the discussions, but I just really think they're important to get up right on the table right now. This has been something that's been a long time in coming. As long as Arlock will mention, we've been working on this since 1995. This whole issue was a plot line in one of the episodes of The West Wing, which very closely paralleled the actual experience during the Clinton administration, so a little bit of TV history here. Secondly, there's a lot of work still to be done. This is not a done deal. There's lots of decisions to be made. We need to get appropriations so that the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics can do their work, gather their data, do the analysis. It's at least a year away. And supplemental is supplemental. It's not going to replace the official poverty measure, which will continue to be used for allocation of federal funds and for eligibility purposes. So we'll talk about those things in more detail in a little bit later. I'm really pleased that we have some great expertise here today. Arlock Sherman, Indy Dedagupa, and Annette Case. They're great folks. We've worked with them a lot, and I think you'll find them fascinating. The way we want to proceed this afternoon is to have Arlock and Indy provide a brief history and background of the poverty measure, the official poverty measure, talk a little bit about the National Academy of Sciences report in 1995, and about the Measuring American Poverty Act that's now before Congress. Then we're going to break for questions from you folks. So while Arlock and Indy are talking, please be sure to send me your questions and comments just the way that Jessica suggested. Then we're going to go back to Arlock, who will talk a little bit more about the supplemental poverty measure, and then we'll take some more questions. Finally, I'll turn it over to Annette, who will offer some observations on the supplemental poverty measure and also expand the discussion to related issues. We'll wrap up with a final session of questions and answers. As you can see, Arlock is a senior researcher at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Prior to joining the center, Arlock worked at the Children's Defense Fund and the Center for Law and Social Policy. Indy Dedagupa is a professional staff for the House Ways and Means Committee, specifically the Subcommittee on Income Security and Family Support. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Arlock. Take it away, Arlock.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everyone. The official poverty measure was developed in the 1960s by federal economist Molly Orshansky, who said, you are poor if your family's annual cash income is below your family's poverty line, which she defined based on the lowest nutritionally adequate food budget from USDA multiplied by 3. Why 3? because average families of all income levels spent 1/3 of their after-tax income on food, according to the then latest consumption survey, which was from 1955. She adjusted up or down depending on the number and age of people in your family, and since then the resulting poverty thresholds have more or less been updated only by the Consumer Price Index. So what does this measure leave out? The current poverty measure misses key resources that families use to meet their basic needs, such as nutrition and housing assistance and tax credits, which have been expanded in recent years, particularly for families with children, and now lift more children out of poverty than all cash benefits combined. So it's a big omission. On the flip side, the official measure ignores the cost of child care and transportation and other necessary work-related expenses that reduce your disposable income, as well as medical expenses, which also take away from what you can spend on needs like food, clothing, and shelter. And the census poverty line is the same nationwide, even though HUD says the fair market rent in San Francisco is double the level in rural North Dakota, say. And the measure is out of date in the sense that it relies on these very old spending patterns from the 50s and ignores a variety of changes in social expectations, really, since then. Back then it was less taken for granted that families would pay for child care to go to work or own a car to drive out to where the jobs are or save for college for your kids. So in response, an expert panel of the National Academy of Sciences in 1995 issued recommendations for reviving the poverty measure, and we'll talk details in a minute, but an oversimplified version of what they said was, you are poor if your family has too little cash and non-cash income available after taxes and expenses to pay what relatively low-spending Americans pay for food, clothing, shelter, including utilities, and as they put it, a little more for other necessities. I'm going to stop and turn it over to Indy, who will talk now about how Congress took it from there.
Thank you, Arlok and Mike and everyone for joining this webinar. I am just going to highlight on this first slide the asterisk at the bottom that the views here are my own. And I'm going to go through some of this quite quickly to save time for questions, but you'll see my email address on this slide, and I'm more than happy to take additional questions if we run out of time during this webinar. So first, here's a quick overview of the big questions I want to start to address this presentation. So how could a new measure help? And in particular, the reason why we became involved and developed what Mike mentioned, the Measuring American Poverty Act, was the first bullet here, which I think many of us would sort of agree with as one of the motivations as to why we're even participating and listening to this webinar now. We find poverty is a very important measure for a whole range of reasons, but as noted here, well-being is multidimensional, and poverty, even on its own, is multidimensional, and it's important to keep that in mind. We also thought it's important to think about the value of a measure beyond just the headline. So a single measure, whether it's the official measure or supplemental measure, can result in multiple viewpoints here. It's not just about how many people are above or below a line, but maybe the gap between people who are below and the line, the persistence of poverty, the concentration of poverty, and many other ways of using a single measure, and the different purposes that measures serve. In particular, as Mike mentioned, the supplemental poverty measure doesn't affect eligibility in any way, and it's intended to be an economic statistic. And then finally, the starting point matters. So what I mean by that is it certainly matters what you initially see under a new measure, but it also matters how that might change over time, and that's just something I'd like to emphasize. So the Measuring American Poverty Act, it was introduced in the 110th Congress and then also in the 111th Congress. The information is available on the slide now. After 2 hearings, we decided to move forward with this legislation that had 3 basic parts. One is a modern poverty measure, which I'll focus on. A second one is a decent living standard panel, so a panel by the National Academy of Sciences to develop a higher standard that we refer to as a decent living standard in the proposal. And similarly for medical risk measure, which would answer the question, to what extent are people at risk of being unable to afford needed medical care and treatment. We kept the official measure as is in this proposal, but renamed it. And again, there was no impact on eligibility or distribution of federal funds. And these are some of the highlights here of what the MAP Act does. We think it addresses the major concerns that RLOC raised. It shifts authority from poverty statistics right now falling under the somewhat more political Office of Management and Budget in the federal government to the statistical agencies. And we think it's broadly consistent with how people understand poverty and moves forward after years of research. And so the modern poverty measure itself is based on these recommendations that RLOC described quickly from the National Academy of Sciences, but we think with substantial and consequential improvements. The essence is, again, as RLOC mentioned, here the threshold is based on modest spending on food, clothing, and shelter, and the income definition is not just the definition of cash income, which is what we use now, but includes additional resources that could allow you to purchase food, clothing, and shelter, and then, importantly, subtracts out work-related medical expenses. It's also important that we emphasize in the bill that there needed to be pre- and post-tax and transfer measures, and both geographically and non-geographically adjusted measures. And so what might happen to official poverty rates? The straightforward answer is nothing, because nothing will happen to the rates. Would our bill pass, or should the administration's proposal for a supplemental poverty measure move forward? But these are some other points I'd like to emphasize, that our proposal, which is, we think, very similar to what the administration has also proposed, has many improvements that have not been perfected yet in methodology, but we are confident will be consequential. And so we're very reluctant to look too closely at existing National Academy of Sciences-based estimates. It's also important, as you'll find in the next webinar, which I encourage everyone to attend, that some decisions will be left to statistical agencies. And so what's next? Well, we're focused right now on the appropriations request. What that means is the administration proposed in its budget for the next fiscal year the Supplemental Poverty Measure. They require money for that, and they have inadequate resources right now to address all the technical and other concerns that need to be addressed to move forward. Congressman McDermott, who is the lead sponsor of the Measuring American Poverty Act, submitted a letter to the appropriations committees, the relevant committees in the House, the subcommittees in the House, and the letter not only supports the administration's request to move forward with the supplemental poverty measure, but also emphasizes that the Measuring American Poverty Act included funding in this proposal for a higher standard, a decent living standard, that was not included in the administration's budget. And so the letter also requests additional funding for National Academy of Sciences panel to move forward on such a standard. So with that, I will pass it back to RLOC, who will explain the details of the supplemental poverty measure in more detail.
Okay, well, let me first take some questions from the audience. I have quite a few lined up here. The one that almost everyone always asks right away, and maybe RLOC, you want to take this one, is, so how much will the poverty rate go up or down if we use the supplemental poverty measure?
Well, we don't know yet, because there are a lot of details that matter that are yet to be fleshed out. But we'll get to some estimates in a moment that suggest that the most likely thing is for poverty overall to go up by a few points, and for it to go up for most age groups. There may be particular parts of the country where it stays steady or conceivably goes down a little bit.
Okay, great. Here's a question that I think a lot of folks always ask. Since it's widely acknowledged that the current measure of poverty is outdated, really inadequate, why can't we just scrape it and replace it with an entirely new measure? Indy, you want to take that?
Yes, that's a great question. The current measure is tied in some way or another to about 80 programs that spend hundreds of billions of dollars of public funds, and it would be consequential in maybe undesirable and unpredictable ways to scrap that. The current measure serves a very useful purpose for program eligibility. It has a narrower income definition and a more straightforward one. And I think about somebody applying, say, for school lunch or school breakfast, and I wouldn't want them to spend too much time and pages and pages and pages detailing all their sources of income to apply for such a program. But the current poverty measure wouldn't require that because of its narrower income definition.
Okay, and related to that, go ahead.
Well, and Mike, I was going to just add that for a number of years, Census thinks they will be tinkering with the new definition. So if nothing else for historical continuity, it will be valuable to have a steady series that shows how we compare to the past. Because for all its flaws, the current poverty measure does show a lot.
Okay, here's a couple quick questions. This one relates to the answer you just gave, Indy, but I think it's worth repeating. If the level goes up, do more people become eligible for federal programs such as food stamps and things that are based on the poverty measure? And I think your answer is?
Nothing should happen immediately or as a direct result of the measure. What we think could happen is that we will have a better sense of poverty in a way that might better inform debate. I think about it often, as do many others, as the unemployment rate, which has really no bearing on individuals' eligibility for regular unemployment insurance benefits, but nevertheless informs our policy.
Great. We're getting lots of questions here. Question is, how much is involved in the appropriation? That's before Congress right now, Indy? For
$7.5 million per year.
With an M.
Yeah, with an M.
Great. And then how do you define non-cash income? Arlek, you want to take that?
So this is Arlek. It's income assistance that is, in this case, food assistance, food stamps, housing rental assistance from Section 8 and other state and federal rent subsidies, and the low-income home energy program, LIHEAP. And they would also count after-tax income, including the value of tax credits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. So there was discussion in the past about some other non-cash benefits, such as the value of Medicaid, Medicare, and the determination by the National Academy experts was that the effort to count those didn't really make sense. Those didn't work like things you could spend to meet your day-to-day basic needs. They were very important if you had a catastrophic illness or something, but they developed the way we're describing to handle those on a somewhat, essentially take those out of the poverty equation.
Okay. One last question before we move on. There's a lot here, but I can't get to all of them. And this is a more political question, a policy-related question. How would you respond to social conservatives or conservatives who charge that this is just an effort to raise the poverty threshold and show more people are poor? And how do you respond to their assertions that the number of people in poverty are grossly overstated because folks nowadays have color TVs, cell phones, air conditioning, and plumbing? Indy, you want to take that plumbing question?
Sure. So first is that this is based on recommendations from a near unanimous nonpartisan National Academy of Sciences panel. And in addition, this is a measure that's been calculated now since the, I believe, mid-'90s, very soon after the panel's recommendations were released. It's been calculated officially in sort of an official capacity by the Census Bureau, and those are the sorts of estimates people see. Now, we think just to reiterate a point from my presentation, we think the administration is proposing a more markedly improved version of these measures. But secondly, on the question of changes in material sort of access to lower income folks in the U.S. today, well, the first thing is I think it's important that the measure is measuring people's ability to have adequate income and thus to buy basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. Now, all those other needs are I think socially expected and important, and to be frank, a TV might be a far better way to spend money on entertainment than what the vast majority of people often spend money on entertainment. But the issue here is, do we want to go back and measure ourselves against standards from 50 or 100 years ago and say, well, everyone has indoor plumbing and so nobody is poor? Or are we interested as policymakers and the public in whether or not incomes are adequate to meet these actual basic needs of food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and a little bit more?
Okay, great. Then let's turn it over to Arlok, who will talk a little bit more about what's in the Supplemental Poverty Measure, what's the provisions, what thresholds, things like that. Arlok, take it away.
So the details. Last month, Census got the green light from the administration to develop, in consultation with other statistical agencies, a new poverty measure that bears a striking resemblance to what Indy just described in the Measuring American Poverty Act. As we've heard, this will not replace other poverty work Census has been doing or affect program eligibility, but it will be a new statistic that gets high visibility and lots of detailed national tables published, compared to the kind of comparable to the current poverty measure, with a first release of this data expected in fall of next year. It's still in a developmental phase, so there will be tweaks for a few years, but the document that guides Census is a memo from this federal interagency working group led by the Office of Management and Budget that is online at census.gov, and it essentially gives a number of starting suggestions and then gives Census and BLS authority to diverge from this as they learn more and go along. And here's what the guidance says. Rather than only counting family annual cash income, the SPM will also include income from food stamps, now known as the SNAP program, the value of those other non-cash programs we described, and tax credits, and will subtract taxes and necessary work expenses like childcare and transportation, and will subtract out-of-pocket medical expenses because those aren't part of the bundle of goods that will make up the new poverty line. And so counting that income would be inconsistent with the new poverty line. Consistency between the resource measure and the measure of needs was paramount in the National Academy's recommendations, and this holds true to that. So what is the new poverty line? As we were saying, the old poverty line was built around food spending. The new line is built around what relatively low-spending Americans pay for food, clothing, shelter, including utilities like phone, heating, electricity, And specifically, it's built around the 33rd percentile of spending on those basic needs among two-child families. And the 33rd percentile is the level where one-third of families spend less, two-thirds spend more, and Census will use a moving average, or the guidance is to use a moving average of spending data for the last 5 years. So they would take that spending level, they'd add another 20% to it to cover other miscellaneous necessities, and that's your SPM poverty line. And the latest figures that are published online look like $27,000 a year for 2008. More recent work by BLS staff suggests that that could change. It may end up being more like $24,000. It's still very much a work in progress. There are factors that could raise it up again, even conceivably higher. But this is nationwide overall higher than the 22,000 figure for the official poverty measure. And it will be adjusted for family size. So they'll start with this prototypical two-child family. They'll adjust by local costs of living. The guidance says one would ideally look at all variation in all kinds of local costs, but at least initially, Census is likely to use variation just in housing costs because that's where there's good local data. Based on some of their recent calculations, the 2008 poverty line then might range from about $22,000 in rural North Dakota up to as much as $33,000 in metropolitan California and higher than that in Hawaii. It could potentially go lower than the official threshold in some parts of the country. Another adjustment that they will make is for home ownership status. So for homeowners with no mortgage, Census and BLS staff have estimated the poverty line might go down. I don't know if it's $9,000, $10,000. It might be lower for those families, and for some other families it would be higher. So that's the plan. Census and BLS staff have some new experimental results that get as close as they can to this plan, but they're still, as I say, working out details. But the next slide will show some of these interim findings. I'm going to breeze past them here. Actually, I should mention that for every poverty calculation, you have to know who you're calculating it for. And it used to be that the family that you'd calculate it for was people related by birth, marriage, or adoption. They would broaden that to include unmarried partners and their children and foster children. But in terms of what the latest interim findings I've seen, the overall poverty rate might go up from 12.5 to 19.5%, go up for all age groups, race groups, also for all regions. The poverty rates are likely to rise. The new supplemental poverty experimental findings are in dark blue. The official findings are in light blue. The poverty rates would likely rise, particularly in areas of high housing costs, according to the current formula. And so they'd rise more in metropolitan, in the Northeast and the West, and in cities and suburbs than they would in rural areas. And I think I'm going to stop there so we can have some more questions.
Great. Thanks, Arlek. Lots and lots of questions. One is, how was the 33rd percentile chosen?
This is Arlek. I don't know the detailed history of that. I know it was part of the National Academy panel's sense of what was reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
But that might be a good question for Rebecca Blank, who will be appearing next week.
Okay, great. A couple people asked versions of this question. What is the smallest level of geography for which the supplemental poverty rate can be available? And another person asked, how local will the geographic adjustment be for housing, city, state, county? So talk a little bit more about the geography. What scale?
Currently, the plan is to produce this for use with the current population survey, which is the government's national level survey, and they'll have regional numbers, and they may be able to get some state numbers. I'm not sure. Last I heard, there weren't firm plans to make this available at the state and sub-state level, but they're working toward that, and so a status report again from Dr. Blank would be a good thing.
One question is, states that have generous programs for low-income families, things like state-earned income tax credits, generous with vouchers, good health care, presumably they'll see the poverty rate go down a bit because, all else being equal, because of their policies and their interventions that reduce need?
That will be reflected. Their extra effort will, in general, be captured and reflected in a way that it's not in the current measure. That's right.
So just to elaborate, so states that have policies that help families will see their poverty rates go down accordingly, all else being equal.
All else being equal, right. I don't know if they would necessarily go down below the current poverty rate, but that's right. And moving forward over time, the more effort you put into those kinds of assistance, the more that will contribute to poverty reduction.
Okay. A couple of folks asked about the 20%, and what does the 20% include? I think folks are a little bit vague on what this 20% above and beyond just a little bit more means.
The
transportation,
incidental needs, buying shampoo, buying, writing, books for your children for school. They didn't try to enumerate everything that it included. The National Academy expert panel said 15 to 25% seemed like about the right size for incidentals. 15 to an additional 15 to 25%, and what people have tended to do since then is to take the midpoint of that, 20% more for incidentals.
Okay. What about assets? Where do assets get figured into this?
They don't really. This is seen as a measure of the flow of income that you need. And a separate question is, do you have savings that you could live on and spend down on? The closest they come, I think, is probably in the recommendation to include separate thresholds for homeowners who own their homes with no mortgage, free and clear, for renters, and for homeowners still paying a mortgage. That's not directly a response to the homeowners having higher assets so much as them having lower kind of monthly spending needs, though. So I think in general the answer is this is still what it was before, a measure of annual income adequacy.
Okay, great. Couple more questions. This is a question really maybe for Indy. If in the MAP Act contains a provision calling for a decent living standard, a higher threshold that measures something a little bit more than poverty. What are the administration's plans related to that, and where does this stand? And perhaps we'll address this again next week, but a couple folks have asked.
Thanks for the question. I'm not aware of the administration's plans for that. I do know that that's an issue that we raised in our letter to the Appropriations Committee, and it's something we emphasized in our legislation. The decent living standard would be something more comparable to family budgets and basic needs budgets, and even measures that look at thresholds that are shares of median income between, say, 50 to 70%. I know some of these measures can be calculated now, but I understand there is a lot of interest in this sort of work, and it's very useful to continue the conversation on how to have these additional measures.
Okay, great. Another question for Indy, perhaps, is the release of the Supplemental Poverty Measure in the fall of 2011 contingent upon the appropriation? Will the Supplemental Poverty Measure be able to be released if the appropriation is not approved?
I am operating under the assumption that there's just not adequate money within the Census Bureau's budget that's fungible to go forward with that release without the appropriation. So we do believe that the appropriations is needed for that release, which would be simultaneous with the official poverty data release.
Okay. Then related to this, is the decent living standard intended to replace the lower standard income level?
That's a great question. No, we think there are many uses for different measures. If you, for example, only had a very high standard and had a national goal, say, of cutting the number of people below that standard in half, you could easily miss out on other folks who are struggling to meet very basic needs and just help people who are close to that higher threshold. And different measures they mean different things. This threshold is intended in the Supplemental Poverty Measure, intended to reflect the ability of people's sort of income in a given year to meet these very basic needs of sort of universal needs of food, clothing, and shelter. And I think these other measures will be useful for guiding other policy, but they're not intended to be substitutes for each other.
One last question. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by all the questions here, and they're good questions. How do you determine the poverty level for single people with no children? And I think a related question is, how about the elderly? Is there anything special that you would do in this measure to determine poverty for the elderly?
Well, I can say quickly, and then I can turn it over to Arlok if he wants to add something. But currently, the official poverty measure includes a different threshold for elderly households without children, based on the assumption, I believe, from the 50s, maybe 60s, that elderly needed less, they had lower nutritional needs. And the Supplemental Poverty Measure should, just like the Modern Poverty Measure proposed in the MAP Act, get rid of this distinction and treat the elderly as non-elderly households are also treated. And if Arlok wants to add or jump in.
That's right. The old assumption, as I understand it, was it went back really to at least the 30s, that you had more that young males specifically had high-calorie demands because of their labor, their jobs, and everyone else didn't, and the elderly got a lower poverty line because of that. So it was just very outdated. And the new measure smooths over a lot of those funny bumps in the old poverty thresholds. The other nice, it makes allowance for things that matter particularly to the elderly, like out-of-pocket medical spending, and on the flip side, may have that adjustment for homeowners.
Okay. So we strapling young males need extra calories because of all the physical work we do. I never knew that it was there. There's a lot of questions backed up, and I just want to mention, because I do have to move on to Annette, but we'll have the ability to answer questions offline after this, and you'll see the slide that'll explain how to do that. So if we don't get into a question that you're asking right now, we can do that subsequently. So I want to turn now to Annette. Annette Case is a consultant to the Strategies to Eliminate Poverty, or STEP. It's an initiative of the Seattle Foundation focused on policy strategies to reduce poverty and improve economic security, and it's supported by the Northwest Area Foundation. So, Annette, take it away.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. My charge today is to put the SPM in larger context, and so I'm going to make an assumption that pretty much everyone on the call today is really in the business of helping people get on the path to and maintain economic security. And so when we're talking about measures, I think in measurement reform, it's really important to think about this broader context and the role that measures play in achieving that goal. And what we really would like to see is a set of measures, and Indy's talked about this as well, and Arlok, we really want to see a set of measures that help us tell that whole story about not only how are we reducing poverty, but how are we also building economic security. And I think this will help, as Indy also said, it sort of informs our policy conversations, so we can have a different kind of policy conversation when we're looking at the full picture of economic circumstances. So I'm going to talk quickly about just a few key points or principles related to this notion of measurement reform. And the first is to think about how these measures really are describing economic circumstances and how the public is perceiving and understanding those, and what that means for our how that informs policy solutions. And as one example, thinking about the Earned Income Tax Credit, I think we hear a lot, we've said a lot about the Earned Income Tax Credit lifts 5 million people above the poverty line, and that's a true statement. But I think that also potentially gives the public the understanding that poverty has then been addressed and it's solved. And so why would we also need subsidized health care or subsidized child care? And so I think what we really want to see is this framework for with higher measures that I think will help inform our policy solutions and really actually help support those policies that we know work well for families, because they're going to tell us much better how people are doing, how far above the line are they getting, and how much closer are they to making ends meet. And so along with that is understanding sort of the progress of how well people are doing, and that we want measures that really give us that whole continuum of economic circumstances. And I think in doing that, it also helps us think about how we can tackle these problems, because we have a better sense, we have a fuller picture of what's really going on with people, so we can wrap our heads around that there are solutions to these problems, and that communicates much better to the public and to policymakers. And finally, thinking about consistency, we have a lot of measures in play right now and a lot of sort of inconsistencies with those measures and policy. And someone already brought up the question of assets, and that's one that I think is really important. Not only that assets are not in these current measures that we're talking about now, but we do have federal dollars invested in helping people build assets like the American Dream Act to develop IDAs, individual development accounts, but we also insist as people are trying to get benefit from public supports that they have limited or no assets in order to do that. So I think we want measures that help us kind of get some consistency in terms of our policy goals, and that we're measuring those aspects of things that we think are important in terms of getting people onto that path. And so this is just an example of how some of these measures would play out in a state. I'm imagining we have a lot of state groups on the call. And so you can see here that with and this NAS, National Academy of Sciences measure, is sort of SPM-like for metro and non-metro, compared to the official poverty measure, 60% of national median income. And then this cost of living budget was prepared by the Iowa Policy Project. They've done a report on cost of living, and it's what they would call a surviving budget, sort of on the fringes of economic stability. It's a low-cost food budget, cooking all meals at home, only includes transportation for work, and it's a very basic needs type of budget. And you can see here, this really shows the gap between the supplemental and the cost of living. And so I think it's helpful when we're thinking about policy conversations to really have costs associated with some of these elements that every family can understand about transportation, health care, housing, food, taxes. My computer is frozen. Okay.
Oh, dear.
There we go. No, it's okay. Sorry about that. And so this is just to show in Iowa that, we're talking about significant numbers of people who are not meeting the basic cost of living threshold. And that, really this, and just as an example of how this kind of dialogue, how that these numbers can really play a role in policy outcomes, which is really, crucial in terms of what we're talking about here. Iowa actually used this cost of living data to help increase their food stamp eligibility as well as eliminate the asset test for recipients in Iowa. So it can actually really matter, and I think plays an important role in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the states. So I'm gonna sort of breeze through this because we're running out of time. Alternative measures, there's a whole set of alternative measures that we can think about. Family budgets are one, and someone mentioned the lower living standards. BLS also has developed these family living standards, percent of median income, that's used in the UK. Income and material measures, and we talked about that a little bit as well, that having sort of a tiered set of measures that we would use in addition to the supplemental, which would include things like, do people have a good pair of shoes, a warm jacket, is their house able to stay warm, and then using other indicators as well, such as health and assets and education. So finally, where do we go from here? I think this is a critical window of opportunity. I think it's great that we've gotten to this point with the supplemental that we're hoping to get appropriations for it, and I think we really want to see another measure that's implemented at the same time and publicized in the same way as the supplemental and the official, so that we can have this much better conversation, better inform our policy solutions. And we should do that in 2011 if we can, while this decent living standards is being developed, so that we can start to have that conversation. And meanwhile, at the same time, in the states, I think states have an important role to play about sort of accurately labeling these measures. That the SPM is really a measure of extremely low income. So I think it would be important to sort of be able to talk about that. There might be some confusion at the state level about how this is going to be implemented, and what this would mean relative to the official measure and program eligibility. I could see that confusion would happen, and so states can really help dispel some of that by labeling it for what it is, and to continuing to use these measures. I know a lot of states have done what Iowa's done in terms of cost of living numbers or self-sufficiency standard, family budgets, and other similar measures. And so I think they can continue to really try to push these and use them a lot in their policy work and outreach work to sort of tell the whole story about what's happening, and then it might filter up to the federal level. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Annette. A lot of good questions. This would be to all three of you. And if you have any reactions, and if you want to respond to each other, feel free to step in and do that. Question: a lot of states have set up poverty commissions. We have the National Half in 10 campaign, and many of these efforts are trying to use the poverty rate as a target, as a way to set a challenge for policymakers to say, let's reduce poverty by half in 10 years, something like that. Which poverty measure would be used for that purpose? The official poverty measure or the supplemental poverty measure? Annette or Indy?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the states, I think states could choose. I don't want to speak for half in 10. I think that's based on the supplemental, and Indy probably know more about that. Yeah. So I think, but in terms of these other state projects, I think states really have a lot of leeway to decide what kind of measures they want to use and how they want to, what kind of policy conversation they want to have, knowing that the supplemental and the official are going to have different implications than other measures like a family budget.
Yeah, this is Arlock. I think Annette makes a couple of good points. First, that the supplemental poverty measure is something that a lot of places are considering. In New York, even was out ahead in some ways of the national researchers in developing. New York City developed its own version. Now New York State has developed its own version of a National Academy of Sciences SPM type measure, and that's because when they put effort into housing assistance and nutrition and other areas, they want tax credits. They want it reflected in account, and they want to get credit for that. So, and that seems right. It does highlight how important it will be to be able to move the federal statistical agencies along toward their ultimate goal. What I hope is something they can accomplish of bringing this measure down to the state and local level. And then a final point that I think Annette was right on target about was that this poverty measure does not solve the problem of the lowness of the poverty line, of the outdatedness of the poverty line. The supplemental poverty measure doesn't really try to solve that problem. I think a lot of anti-poverty groups and the poverty reduction goal commissions around the country are therefore aiming higher than this poverty threshold, and with a very good reason.
And I would just say, given the case in Iowa, that I think it is, it's important. I don't think they would have been able to have that conversation with their policymakers if they were just talking about the poverty measure, the supplemental.
But what the technology that the Census and BLS are developing can do is you can a state can set a higher threshold and then have the income measure and so forth available to it through this process, ideally. Okay,
great. We only have a few minutes left, and one question has come up a couple of times, and I think in some ways you've addressed it, but I want to make it absolutely clear. And this question is, if the poverty rates go down, supplemental poverty measure rates go down because states are being generous in helping their people, wouldn't the states get penalized by getting less federal money since so much federal money is tied to the poverty rate?
Yeah, I can take that. That's a good question. So, again, the federal money would continue to be tied to the existing poverty measure and the official poverty measure and the official poverty rate first. Of course, it's still a valid question. At any point, laws can change, but that's how we would expect things to move forward for good reason, not least of which is what Arlette mentioned also, that there needs to be a few years of perfecting this measure. But the other thing is that one of the advantages to a measure like this is we will be able to tease out where the money is coming from. To be completely accurate, where basically what the statisticians, the very talented folks at Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics will be doing is putting together all the money from all these different sources for each individual family. So we will be able to, advocates and researchers and organizers will be able to say, hey, if you cut this local refundable tax credit, not only are X number of people going to lose the benefit, which you might be able to estimate now, but also the number of children in poverty will change by this much. So you actually might have this as a very helpful tool to argue for additional resources too.
Question here is, will the presentations in this session, this webinar, be downloadable? And I think part of the answer is that we will have ongoing access to the presentations and this recording available through Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, the source for news, ideas, and action. So, if you missed part of this or you want to visit, go ahead.
I want to jump in as well and say that for a PDF version of the presentations, you can download that by clicking on the icon in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like 3 pieces of paper, and it's also available on the launch page you come in through. We'll also be sending a link to the recording in a follow-up email as well.
Great. And then one final question as we're wrapping up. It says, to what extent have state or local implementers of programs been involved in this study, in this effort?
Really quickly, I'll just highlight New York City did its own look at additional measurements and came to decide upon using a very similar measurement. There are important differences, but they also, after lots of consultation, decided to go with something based on the National Academy of Sciences report. And I know other groups have independently chosen different measures, and for different good reasons. Like Half and 10 is choosing this measure. It will be a somewhat official measure, the proposed supplemental poverty measure, and that makes enormous sense for a national goal.
And I'll add to that I know that the states of Connecticut and Minnesota have worked with the Urban Institute using a variation on this supplemental poverty measure to guide some work that they're doing, poverty commissions in those states. And I can vouch for it because many folks have contacted me about trying to obtain the data necessary for the state groups to do this type of work. So I think there's a whole lot of interest all around the country. I know Jody Levin-Epstein at CLASP continues to get requests from state organizations and local organizations on this. So it's, I think, time to wrap up. I want to reiterate. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to really quickly say, too, though, I'm not sure how many states have been involved in sort of as this is developing and as Census makes decisions. So I think it would be important for state groups that are on this call to really be in touch with Indy and other people to talk about what this might look like in their state and thinking about other measures and developing a decent living standard.
That's a very good segue to this point. The next webinar is a week from today, April 24th, same time, same place. Becky Blank from the Department of Commerce, the Undersecretary there and the lead person on this, it will be a guest, and I think you'll be able to ask some of these questions and to engage with the folks who are very much involved in this. And again, it's been a wonderful session. I greatly appreciate our guests, and Indy and Ned and Arlok. Thank you so much, and hope to talk to all of you next week. Bye now.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I would just like to say on behalf of Peach New Media, thank you to our sponsors for holding today's webinar. And if you all would take a moment to fill out the survey that you see up on your screen right now, just to give us your opinion on this webinar and upcoming webinars. We do hope to see you on April 21st, next Wednesday, for the next webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers for sharing their expertise, and thanks also to our participants for your great questions. This concludes today's webinar. To end this call, simply hang up.